You've already had caffeine today. Most of you had it within the first hour of waking up. And if you didn't, there's a reasonable chance you're feeling it right now. That familiar low-grade drag, the slightly slower processing, the background irritability that you've probably learned to manage by reaching for a cup of something. Caffeine is the most widely consumed psychoactive substance on the planet. Not alcohol, not nicotine, caffeine. An estimated 80 to 90% of adults in the United States consume it daily, and global consumption runs somewhere around 10 billion kilograms per year. But here's the thing. Most people who rely on caffeine every single day have almost no idea what it's actually doing inside their brain and their heart. They know it wakes them up. They know too much makes them jittery. And beyond that, the understanding gets pretty vague pretty fast. So today we're going to fix that. We're going to look at exactly how caffeine works at the molecular level inside your brain, why it affects your heart the way it does, what tolerance actually means physiologically, what happens when you stop, and what the evidence actually says about whether this substance is good, bad, or somewhere in between for your long-term health. It's going to be a caffeinated one. So let's jump into this anatomical and physiological awesomeness. By the end of this video, you're going to understand caffeine in a way that most people, including many regular users, simply don't. You'll know exactly what's happening in your brain the moment caffeine enters your bloodstream, why your afternoon cup hits differently than your morning one, and what caffeine dependence actually looks like at the cellular level. And you'll have a genuinely informed answer the next time someone asks you whether caffeine is actually good for you, because the answer is more interesting than most people expect. Caffeine belongs to a class of compounds called methylxanthines, and it's found naturally in the seeds, leaves, and fruit of a number of plants, most famously coffee beans, tea leaves, and cacao. From a plant's perspective, caffeine is actually a natural pesticide. It's toxic to insects that try to feed on the plant. As an FYI, it's also mildly toxic to dogs and cats, which is why we keep coffee and chocolate away from them. In humans, caffeine is absorbed rapidly through the gastrointestinal tract. When you drink a cup of coffee, caffeine begins entering your bloodstream within about 15 to 45 minutes, and it reaches peak blood concentration somewhere between 30 and 60 minutes after consumption. Its half-life in a healthy adult is approximately 5 to 6 hours, meaning that if you have a cup of coffee at 3 in the afternoon, roughly half of that caffeine is still circulating in your system at 8 or 9 in the evening. That half-life matters, and we'll come back to it. But first, we need to talk about what caffeine is actually doing once it reaches your brain, because the mechanism is more specific and more interesting than most people realize. To understand how caffeine works, we need to briefly talk about a molecule called adenosine. Adenosine is a byproduct of cellular activity in your brain. Every time a neuron fires, every time your brain does work, adenosine accumulates as a result. And throughout the day, as adenosine builds up in your brain, it binds to specific receptors, called adenosine receptors. And when enough of it binds, you start to feel drowsy. You feel the pull towards sleep. That feeling is adenosine doing exactly what it's supposed to do, signaling to your brain that it has been active long enough and that it's time to rest. But there's more happening here. When caffeine blocks adenosine receptors, it also triggers an indirect increase in dopamine signaling in certain brain regions. Dopamine is often described as the brain's reward molecule, and this increase in dopamine activity is part of why caffeine not only reduces fatigue, but also improves mood, focus, and motivation. It's not a dramatic effect. Caffeine is not cocaine, but it's real, it's measurable, and it contributes meaningfully to why caffeine feels the way it does. Now keep in mind that all of this is happening in your brain. But caffeine doesn't stay in your brain, and what it does when it reaches your heart is a separate conversation entirely. Your heart has its own adenosine receptors, and when caffeine blocks those receptors in cardiac tissue, a few things happen. First, caffeine causes a direct stimulatory effect on the heart muscle itself. It can increase heart rate, what clinicians call a chronotropic effect, and it can increase the force of each contraction, what's called an inotropic effect. Additionally, by blocking adenosine receptors in the blood vessels, caffeine promotes vasoconstriction, meaning a narrowing of certain blood vessels, which contributes to a temporary increase in blood pressure. Now, for most healthy adults consuming moderate amounts of caffeine, roughly 200 to 400 milligrams per day, which is approximately 2 to 4 standard cups of coffee, these cardiovascular effects are transient. Your body compensates relatively quickly, and blood pressure tends to normalize within a few hours. But here's something worth understanding. The magnitude of caffeine's cardiovascular effects varies significantly from person to person, and a large part of that variation comes down to genetics, specifically how quickly your liver metabolizes caffeine. The enzyme responsible for breaking down about 95% of the caffeine in your body is called CYP1A2. Some people have a version of this gene that makes them fast metabolizers. Their bodies clear caffeine efficiently, and the cardiovascular effects are milder and shorter-lived. Others are slow metabolizers, meaning caffeine stays in their system longer and the heart and blood pressure effects are more pronounced and prolonged. And this genetic difference has real clinical implications. A study published in JAMA found that among people with hypertension, those who were slow metabolizers of caffeine showed a significantly higher risk of heart attack with higher caffeine intake, while fast metabolizers showed no such increased risk and in some cases showed a mild protective effect. So when someone tells you that coffee is either totally fine or definitely bad for your heart, they're probably both right and both wrong, because the answer depends significantly on who you are genetically. But there's something else happening with long-term caffeine use that changes this picture even further, and it involves what tolerance actually is at the cellular level. Here's what most people don't know about caffeine tolerance. When you consume caffeine regularly, day after day, week after week, your brain doesn't just get used to it in some vague, general way. It physically changes in response to it. Specifically, your brain upregulates adenosine receptors. It grows more of them. Think about what this means. If caffeine is consistently blocking your adenosine receptors, your brain responds by producing more adenosine receptors to compensate. More targets for adenosine to bind to. More pathways for the sleep signal to get through. The result is that over time, you need more caffeine to block enough receptors to produce the same alerting effect. That's tolerance in its most literal, physiological sense. It's not psychological, it's structural. Your brain has actually changed its receptor density in response to the substance. And this also explains withdrawal. When a regular caffeine user stops consuming it, they don't simply return to their pre-caffeine baseline. They now have more adenosine receptors than they started with. And adenosine, which has been building up all along, suddenly has an abundance of available receptors to bind to. The result is a flood of adenosine signaling: headache, fatigue, difficulty concentrating, irritability, and in some cases, nausea. These symptoms typically begin 12 to 24 hours after the last dose and can last anywhere from 2 to 9 days as receptor density gradually normalizes. This is recognized in clinical literature as caffeine withdrawal, and it meets formal diagnostic criteria for a substance withdrawal syndrome. This doesn't mean caffeine is equivalent to drugs of abuse. The magnitude and consequences are dramatically different. But it does mean that the word dependence applies in a precise physiological sense. Now, with all of this as context, let's address the question that most people actually want answered. Is caffeine actually good or bad for you? The honest answer, based on the current body of evidence, is that for most healthy adults, moderate caffeine consumption appears to be neutral to mildly beneficial over the long term. Multiple large observational studies have found associations between regular coffee and tea consumption and reduced risk of type 2 diabetes, Parkinson's disease, certain liver conditions including cirrhosis and liver cancer, and some cognitive decline in older adults. And while observational studies can't prove causation, these associations are consistent enough across different populations and study designs that researchers take them seriously. Caffeine is also one of the few substances with genuinely well-supported evidence for acute performance benefits. It improves endurance performance, reaction time, attention, and certain types of cognitive function. These aren't subtle effects. They're robust enough that caffeine is one of the most studied ergogenic aids in sports science. Now, there are populations where this changes. Pregnant individuals are advised to limit caffeine to under 200 milligrams per day due to evidence of increased miscarriage risk and potential effects on fetal development at higher doses. People with anxiety disorders often find that caffeine significantly worsens their symptoms, which makes physiological sense given the dopamine and stress hormone involvement. And as we discussed, slow metabolizers with cardiovascular risk factors may face a genuinely elevated cardiac risk from higher intake. One more thing worth addressing. The timing of your caffeine consumption matters more than most people appreciate. Because of caffeine's 5 to 6 hour half-life, consuming caffeine in the afternoon or evening significantly impairs sleep quality, even when people report falling asleep normally. Research has shown that caffeine consumed 6 hours before bedtime reduces total sleep time by more than an hour and worsens sleep architecture even when the person doesn't notice subjective differences in how they slept. Poor sleep, over time, has well-documented consequences for cardiovascular health, metabolic function, and cognitive performance. Consequences that could easily outweigh any benefits you're getting from the caffeine itself. Here's the pattern worth taking away from all of this. Caffeine works because it fits into a system your body already has, the adenosine sleep pressure system, and temporarily disrupts it. It's not creating energy. It's not bypassing your biology. It's borrowing alertness from later and masking a signal your brain is already sending. Used strategically, that's a genuinely useful tool. Used habitually and without attention to timing, it can quietly undermine the very thing most people are trying to protect: their ability to think clearly, perform well, and recover properly. The dose, the timing, and your individual genetics all matter. And now you actually have the anatomical and physiological framework to make those decisions with something other than habit or marketing driving them. If you want to keep learning anatomy and physiology and see more of what we do, all of that information will be in the description below. Thanks for watching, everyone, and we'll see you in the next video.